The wind howled through the abandoned outskirts of White Pine, Montana, carrying with it the kind of cold that settles into bones and refuses to leave. Helena Marsh knelt in the snow, her hands raw and bleeding, gripping a rusted shovel that had seen better days. The metal scraped against frozen earth with a sound that echoed her breaking heart, each strike a desperate plea to a winter that showed no mercy. Around her, the world stretched endlessly white, a blank canvas that had swallowed every trace of warmth from her life. The small bundle wrapped in her only good blanket lay beside her. So still, it seemed the very universe held its breath in reverence. She had walked 3 miles from the trailer park where nobody answered doors anymore, where eyes peeked through curtains but hands never reached out to help. The community center had closed its doors when she arrived with her son's body, citing regulations and paperwork, and a coldness that had nothing to do with the temperature. The funeral home required payment up front, an impossible sum for a woman who had been surviving on expired food from the donation bin and the kindness that had long since dried up in this forgotten corner of America. So Helena had taken matters into her own hands, carrying her 7-year-old son Ethan through the snow to the old cemetery at the edge of town, where the fence had fallen years ago, and nobody seemed to remember or care who was buried beneath the weathered stones. Her fingers had lost feeling an hour ago, but she continued digging, driven by a love that transcended physical limitations. Ethan deserved better than this, better than a mother who couldn't afford medicine when the fever took hold, better than a world that had turned its back on them both when her husband left and the factory closed and the bills piled higher than the snowdrifts. Yet this was all she had left to give him, this patch of frozen ground, and the determination that even if the world had forgotten them, she would not forget her baby boy. Tears froze on her cheeks before they could fall, crystallizing her grief into something tangible and sharp. The sky above darkened as afternoon surrendered to evening, and still Helena dug. Her back screamed in protest, her shoulders burned with exertion, and her lungs ached from breathing air so cold it felt like swallowing glass. The hole was barely 2 feet deep, the earth beneath the snow layer proving harder than stone, resistant to her desperate efforts. She thought about giving up, about lying down in the snow beside Ethan, and letting the winter take them both. But something stubborn in her core refused to surrender. She had survived her husband's abandonment, the shame of asking for help that never came, the judgment in the eyes of former friends who blamed her for circumstances beyond her control. She would survive this too, even if survival meant nothing more than giving her son the dignity of a proper resting place. That was when she heard the vehicles approaching, the rumble of expensive engines cutting through the silence like thunder. Helena didn't look up, didn't stop her digging. People passed by all the time on the county road that skirted the cemetery, rushing toward lives that mattered, toward destinations where they were expected and welcomed. She was invisible to them, had been invisible for so long she had almost forgotten what it felt like to be seen. The convoy of black SUVs would pass like all the others, and she would remain alone with her grief and her impossible task, exactly as the world preferred. But the vehicles didn't pass. They slowed, then stopped, their headlights cutting through the gathering darkness and illuminating Helena's small figure hunched over the frozen ground. She heard doors opening, footsteps crunching through snow, voices conferring in low tones that carried an authority she recognized from her old life before everything fell apart. Still, she didn't look up, didn't acknowledge the intrusion. Whatever they wanted, whatever regulations or laws she was breaking by being here, none of it mattered anymore. Let them arrest her. Let them add one more failure to her endless list. She had nothing left to lose except these final hours with her son. The footsteps approached until they stopped just beyond the small pile of frozen dirt she had managed to extract. Helena felt the weight of observation, felt the question forming in the silence. Her hands tightened on the shovel handle, prepared to defend her right to this small piece of earth, ready to fight if necessary. A shadow fell across the shallow grave, and finally she looked up. The man standing before her was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a black coat that probably cost more than she had earned in the past year. His face was weathered in a way that spoke of battles fought and won, with eyes that seemed to see everything and reveal nothing. He held himself with the kind of confidence that came from never being told no, from commanding rooms and boards and entire corporations with nothing more than his presence. Helena recognized power when she saw it, even if she didn't recognize the man himself. His security team stood at a respectful distance, watching but not interfering, waiting for direction from their employer. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, this woman broken by loss, and this man surrounded by everything money could buy. Helena expected him to tell her to leave, to threaten her with trespassing charges, to call the authorities and have her removed from property that probably belonged to some trust or corporation. Instead, he looked past her to the small bundle, to the shallow hole, to the shovel in her bleeding hands. Something in his expression shifted, a crack appearing in the carefully constructed facade of the successful businessman, the leader they called the Alpha King in boardrooms across the country. "You're alone," he said, and it wasn't a question, but an observation laden with understanding that surprised them both. Helena nodded once, too exhausted for words, too broken to explain how she had arrived at this moment. The man turned to his security detail and spoke words she couldn't quite hear. Two of them moved toward the vehicles, returning moments later with tools, professional-grade shovels, and picks designed for hard ground. But their boss didn't wait for them to begin. He removed his expensive coat, handing it to the nearest guard, and rolled up the sleeves of his custom shirt. Then he stepped forward, took one of the shovels, positioned himself beside Helena, and began to dig. The frozen earth resisted his efforts, just as it had resisted hers, but he attacked it with a determined fury that matched her own desperation. His security team exchanged glances, clearly shocked by their employer's actions, but none dared to question him. They joined in, forming a circle around the gravesite, their movements efficient and practiced. Helena watched for a moment, unable to process what was happening, unable to believe that these strangers, these wealthy, powerful people, had stopped their important journey to help her with this impossible task. Then she joined them again, her small shovel working alongside their professional tools, her exhausted body finding new strength in the solidarity of shared purpose. As darkness settled completely over White Pine, and the temperature dropped even further, they dug together in silence, their breath forming clouds in the frozen air, their hands working in unison toward a goal that transcended explanation. The work continued under the harsh illumination of portable lights that the security team had set up around the gravesite, transforming the abandoned cemetery into an eerie construction zone. The Alpha King, whose real name Helena still didn't know, worked with the same intensity he brought to everything in his life, attacking the frozen ground as if it had personally offended him. Sweat appeared on his forehead despite the brutal cold, and his expensive shirt became soaked through within the first hour. Beside him, Helena moved like someone in a trance, her body operating on pure willpower while her mind remained somewhere else, somewhere far from this frozen hell where mothers buried their children alone. The security team worked efficiently, coordinating their efforts to maximize progress. They had clearly done difficult labor before, despite their current roles protecting one of the most powerful men in America. The Alpha King had a reputation for hiring former military, people who understood discipline and loyalty, and the importance of completing a mission regardless of circumstances. Now that mission was helping a stranger dig a grave in the middle of nowhere, and not one of them questioned the orders. They followed their employer's lead with the same dedication they would bring to protecting him from physical threats, treating this task with the seriousness it deserved. Helena's mind drifted as her body continued the repetitive motion of lifting and dumping frozen earth. She thought about Ethan's laugh, the way it had filled their small trailer with warmth, even when the heating bill went unpaid. She remembered teaching him to read with library books because she couldn't afford new ones, watching his face light up as words transformed into stories. She recalled the morning he had proudly presented her with a drawing of their family, just the two of them holding hands under a smiling sun, because even at 7 years old he understood that sometimes the smallest family was also the most complete. The fever had come so quickly, burning through his small body with terrifying speed. She had tried everything, desperate home remedies passed down from her grandmother. Cold baths, prayer, and finally the emergency room where they had turned her away because she lacked insurance and the upfront payment they required. The sound of metal striking stone jerked her back to the present. One of the security team members had hit bedrock, the shovel reverberating with the impact. They consulted briefly, then adjusted their strategy, widening the hole rather than going deeper. The grave was taking shape now. A proper rectangle carved from the resistant earth, deep enough to protect Ethan from animals, dignified enough to honor his memory. Helena felt tears threatening again, overwhelmed by the kindness of these strangers who owed her nothing and yet gave her everything. The Alpha King paused to catch his breath, leaning on his shovel and studying Helena with that penetrating gaze that had probably intimidated countless business rivals. Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes, markers of stress and sleepless nights that wealth couldn't erase. There was something haunted in his expression, a shadow that seemed at odds with his reputation as an untouchable titan of industry. When he spoke, his voice was rougher than before, scraped raw by exertion and cold air. How old was he? The question hung in the frozen air between them, simple, yet profound. Helena swallowed hard, her throat tight with unshed tears. 7, she managed, the word barely a whisper. Ethan. His name was Ethan. The Alpha King nodded slowly, something shifting behind his eyes. I had a son, he said, and Helena's attention sharpened despite her exhaustion. He would have been 8 next month. The past tense landed like a physical blow, and suddenly this powerful man's presence here made terrible sense. He wasn't helping a stranger out of abstract charity or calculated public relations. He was helping because he understood, because he carried his own unbearable loss, because in this frozen cemetery, they were equals stripped of all pretense and protection. Helena wanted to ask what happened, wanted to know how someone with all his resources and power had still lost a child. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, they returned to digging, their shared grief creating a bond that required no explanation. The hole grew deeper, the pile of frozen earth beside it growing taller. The security team worked without complaint, their earlier shock at their employer's actions replaced by something like respect. One of them, a woman with military bearing and kind eyes, approached Helena during a brief rest period and pressed a thermos of hot coffee into her hands. Drink, she said gently, and Helena obeyed, the warmth spreading through her chest and loosening the knot of ice that had formed around her heart. As midnight approached, the grave was finally ready. It measured 6 feet long, 4 feet wide, and deep enough to meet any standard of decency. The Alpha King climbed out, his hands bleeding from blisters despite his gloves, his face drawn with exhaustion. He looked at Helena, and she saw her own devastation reflected back at her. Without speaking, they both understood that this was the moment they had been working toward and dreading in equal measure. The moment when Ethan would be laid to rest, when the last physical connection between mother and child would be severed by frozen earth and final goodbyes. Helena retrieved the bundle, cradling it against her chest one last time. She had wrapped Ethan in her best blanket, the blue one with stars that he had loved. The one she had planned to keep forever, as a reminder of his presence in her life. Now it would go into the ground with him, surrounding him with softness and warmth even in death. The Alpha King stepped forward, his movements uncertain for the first time since arriving. May I? He asked, gesturing toward the bundle, and Helena understood that he was asking permission to help lower Ethan into the grave. She nodded, unable to trust her voice, and together they descended into the hole. The placement was gentle, reverent. both of them taking care to position Ethan perfectly in the center of the grave. Helena adjusted the blanket one final time, smoothing imaginary wrinkles, prolonging these last seconds before the inevitable. The Alpha King placed his hand on her shoulder, a gesture of support that somehow gave her the strength to climb back out and face what came next. They stood at the edge of the grave, looking down at the small form barely visible in the harsh light. The security team had removed their hats, standing in respectful silence around the perimeter. Helena's voice broke the stillness, cracked and raw, but determined. She spoke of Ethan's kindness, his laughter, his dreams of becoming a veterinarian because he loved all creatures great and small. She talked about his courage during the illness, how he had tried to comfort her, even as the fever consumed him. She thanked him for being her son, for making her life meaningful, for teaching her that love was worth every sacrifice and every hardship. When she finished, the Alpha King cleared his throat and spoke words in Latin, a prayer or blessing that sounded ancient and powerful. Helena didn't understand the language, but she understood the intention, the desire to send this child off with honor and hope for peace beyond the suffering of this world. Then came the hardest part. Together, they began filling the grave, each shovelful of earth landing with a finality that echoed in Helena's chest. The security team helped, their movements careful and respectful, treating this task with the same care they had brought to the digging. The mound grew slowly, covering the blue blanket, hiding Ethan from view. Helena worked mechanically, her body moving while her mind retreated to protect itself from the full weight of loss. Beside her, the Alpha King showed no signs of stopping, despite his obvious exhaustion, matching her pace, silently communicating that she would not face this alone. When the grave was filled and mounded properly, they stood back to assess their work. It looked too small to contain all the love and hope and dreams that had been buried there. The security team began packing up their equipment as dawn approached, their movements efficient despite the exhaustion visible in every gesture. The Alpha King stood beside the completed grave, hands in his pockets, staring at the mound of frozen earth with an expression Helena couldn't quite interpret. She felt hollowed out, emptied of everything except a bone-deep weariness that went beyond physical fatigue. Yet there was also something unexpected, a tiny seed of gratitude that someone had cared enough to stop, to help, to make sure Ethan received the dignity he deserved. The world hadn't completely forgotten them after all. Helena turned to thank the man who had transformed this nightmare into something bearable. But before she could speak, he gestured toward the lead vehicle. "You're not staying out here," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "My people will take you somewhere warm." Helena wanted to protest, to maintain what little independence she had left, but the truth was she had nowhere to go. The trailer park manager had posted an eviction notice before she left with Ethan's body, and her few belongings were probably already scattered or stolen by now. She was homeless, penniless, and alone in a world that had already demonstrated its capacity for cruelty. Pride seemed like a luxury she could no longer afford. The SUV's interior felt impossibly warm after hours in the freezing cold. The female security agent who had given her coffee earlier sat in the driver's seat, introducing herself as Rebecca Martinez. She drove carefully through the dark roads of White Pine, heading toward the highway that would take them to Great Falls, the nearest city large enough to have proper hotels. The Alpha King rode in another vehicle, already on his phone handling business that apparently couldn't wait even after spending a night digging graves. Helena watched the cemetery disappear in the rearview mirror, feeling both relief and anguish at leaving Ethan behind in that lonely place. Rebecca made small talk during the drive, her voice gentle and careful. She mentioned that their employer had canceled all his appointments for the day, that the board meeting in Seattle would proceed without him, that the merger negotiations would have to wait. Helena processed this information with difficulty, unable to fully grasp how her personal tragedy had disrupted the schedule of one of America's most powerful business leaders. She learned his name was Marcus Thorne, though most people referred to him by his nickname, earned through decades of dominating every industry he touched. the alpha king of corporate America, a man whose decisions moved markets and shaped economies. The hotel in Great Falls was the kind of establishment Helena had only seen in magazines. All marble floors and crystal chandeliers and staff who moved with practiced discretion. Rebecca escorted her through the lobby to a suite on the top floor, a space larger than the trailer Helena had called home. Fresh clothes in her size waited on the bed, along with toiletries and a note in masculine handwriting that simply said, "Take your time." The bathroom alone would have held her entire previous kitchen, with its deep soaking tub and rainfall shower and heated floors. Helena stood in the center of all this luxury, feeling completely out of place, like an actress who had wandered onto the wrong set. After the longest shower of her life, Helena dressed in the provided clothes and discovered food had been delivered during her absence from the main room. The meal was simple, but perfect. Warm soup and fresh bread and hot tea. Exactly what her exhausted body needed. She ate mechanically, tasting nothing, her mind still back at that cemetery with her son. The suite had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, and she stood before them as morning light transformed the sky from black to gray to pale blue. Somewhere out there, Marcus Thorne was probably back to being the Alpha King, making million-dollar decisions and commanding his empire. Their paths had intersected for one strange night, and soon they would diverge forever, returning to their separate worlds. Except Marcus Thorne arrived at her door that afternoon, looking more human than the polished businessman from the cemetery. He wore casual clothes, jeans and a simple sweater, and carried 2 cups of coffee from a local shop. Helena let him in, uncertain about the protocol for entertaining billionaires in hotel suites they were paying for. He settled into one of the armchairs near the window and gestured for her to take the other, creating an arrangement that felt more like friends meeting than stranger helping stranger. For several minutes they sat in silence, sipping coffee and watching the city move below them. "I owe you an explanation," Marcus finally said, setting down his cup. "About last night, about why I stopped." Helena shook her head, uncomfortable with the idea of this powerful man owing her anything. But he continued anyway. "My son Daniel died 3 years ago. Cancer. We had the best doctors, the most advanced treatments, threw everything money could buy at the problem." His voice remained steady, but his hands tightened on the armrests. "In the end, none of it mattered. He died in a hospital room that cost more per day than most people make in a month, surrounded by machines and specialists, and the desperate hope that somehow wealth could cheat death." Helena felt tears prickling her eyes. Not for herself this time, but for this man who had learned the same terrible lesson she now carried. Money couldn't protect you from loss. Power couldn't shield you from pain. Success meant nothing when your child took their last breath. His mother, Marcus continued, and the pronoun choice told Helena everything about that relationship's current status, couldn't handle it. The grief destroyed our marriage within a year. She blamed me for working too much, for not spending enough time with Daniel before the diagnosis. She was right, of course. I had been building an empire while my son was building block towers and learning to ride a bicycle and doing all the things I told myself I would have time for later. He stood and moved to the window, his reflection ghostly in the glass. After the divorce, I threw myself even deeper into work. It was easier than facing what I'd lost, easier than admitting that all my success meant nothing without someone to share it with. Last night, driving through Montana on my way to another meeting I didn't need to attend personally, I saw you kneeling in that snow. And I saw myself, or rather who I should have been when Daniel was sick. Someone willing to drop everything, to get their hands dirty, to be present for what really mattered. Before we continue with the rest of Helena's journey, if you're finding this story meaningful, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories like this one to life. And don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload. Helena absorbed his words slowly, understanding dawning. He hadn't helped her out of pity or obligation, but out of a need to redeem something in himself, to prove that loss hadn't completely destroyed his capacity for human connection. They were both broken people who had found each other in the worst possible moment, and somehow that shared brokenness had created something unexpected. Not friendship exactly, not yet, but perhaps the foundation for one. "What happens now?" Helena asked quietly. Marcus turned from the window, his expression thoughtful. "That depends on what you want. I can arrange for you to stay here while you figure things out, help you find employment, connect you with resources." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Or there's another option. My company has a foundation that funds various charitable initiatives. We're always looking for people who understand hardship firsthand, who can help us direct resources where they're actually needed instead of where they look good on paper. It wouldn't be charity, it would be a job, with a salary and benefits and expectations of performance." Helena stared at him, struggling to process the offer. Yesterday she had been homeless and hopeless, digging a grave with bleeding hands. Today she was being offered employment by one of the richest men in America. It felt surreal, like something that happened to other people in movies, not to women like her who had been abandoned by everyone who was supposed to care. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why would you do this?" Marcus returned to his chair, meeting her gaze directly. "Because Daniel loved helping people. Even when he was sick, he was always thinking about others, asking me to donate to children's hospitals, requesting that his birthday money go to animal shelters. Before he died, he made me promise that I would use my resources to make a difference, not just make money." His voice roughened with emotion. "I've honored that promise through foundation work, but it's always felt distant, abstract. Writing checks and attending galas isn't the same as actually helping someone. Last night, digging beside you, I finally understood what he meant. This is my chance to honor his memory properly, and your chance to rebuild your life, if you're interested." Helena thought about Ethan, about how proud he would be to know his mother was working to help other families avoid their fate. She thought about the alternative, returning to White Pine with nothing and no one, trying to survive in a community that had already demonstrated its indifference. Most of all, she thought about the man sitting across from her, flawed and grieving and willing to acknowledge his mistakes. He was offering her a lifeline, and maybe she was offering him one too, a path back to the humanity he had buried alongside his son. "I'm interested," she said quietly, and felt the first stirring of something that might eventually become hope. Marcus nodded, a small smile appearing for the first time since she had met him. "Good. We'll start tomorrow. Today, just rest. Grieve. Take care of yourself." He stood to leave, then paused at the door. "Helena, I can't bring Ethan back, and you can't bring Daniel back. But maybe we can make sure fewer mothers have to bury their children alone in the snow." After he left, Helena returned to the window and watched the city moving through its normal rhythms. Somewhere in that vast landscape of buildings and businesses and busy people, Marcus Thorne was probably already making arrangements, delegating tasks, setting in motion whatever needed to happen to transform a grieving mother into a foundation employee. And somewhere beyond the city limits, in a frozen cemetery at the edge of a forgotten town, Ethan slept beneath the earth, wrapped in his blue star blanket, watched over by the memory of an Alpha King who had remembered how to be human. The news traveled faster than Marcus had anticipated, spreading through his organization like wildfire through dry timber. By the time he reached his temporary office in Great Falls, his executive assistant had already fielded 24 calls from board members, investors, and senior executives demanding to know why the Alpha King had canceled a critical merger meeting to help a homeless woman bury her child. The carefully maintained image of calculated precision and unwavering focus had developed its first visible crack, and the corporate sharks smelled blood in the water. Marcus listened to the voicemail messages with growing irritation, each one more condescending than the last. They questioned his judgment, his priorities, his fitness to lead the company his grandfather had founded, and he had transformed into a global powerhouse. Several board members suggested he take a leave of absence, citing stress and unresolved grief. Others were more direct, warning that this kind of impulsive behavior endangered shareholder value and corporate reputation. Not one of them acknowledged the fundamental humanity of stopping to help someone in desperate need. Rebecca knocked on his door frame, her expression carefully neutral. "The media has picked up the story, sir. A trucker who passed by the cemetery last night recognized your vehicles and posted about it on social media. It's trending now." She handed him a tablet displaying various news headlines. Billionaire CEO stops convoy to dig grave for stranger's child. Alpha King shows compassionate side during late-night cemetery stop. Marcus Thorne cancels multi-million-dollar meeting to help grieving mother. The articles were split between praising his humanity and questioning his business judgment, with comment sections erupting into fierce debates about wealth, responsibility, and corporate leadership. Marcus set down the tablet and rubbed his eyes, exhaustion finally catching up to him. He hadn't slept since leaving Seattle nearly 48 hours ago, and his body was paying the price for hours of physical labor in sub-zero temperatures. But more than physical tiredness, he felt the weight of decisions that would affect not just himself, but Helena, his company, and the thousands of employees depending on his leadership. He had known this moment would come eventually, the collision between his public persona and his private truth, between what the world expected from the Alpha King and what remained of Marcus Thorne, the grieving father. His phone buzzed with an incoming call from Jonathan Blake, the chairman of Thorne Industries' board of directors and his father's oldest friend. Marcus considered letting it go to voicemail, but knew that would only delay the inevitable confrontation. "Jonathan," he answered, injecting as much professional courtesy as he could muster into his voice. "I've been expecting your call." The chairman's voice came through stern and disappointed, the tone of a parent addressing a wayward child. "Marcus, what were you thinking? The Seattle meeting was crucial for closing the Hexen merger. Without your presence, Robertson is getting cold feet, and the whole deal is in jeopardy." Marcus leaned back in his chair, watching clouds move across the Montana sky through his window. "The Hexen merger will proceed or it won't, based on its merits as a business proposition. My attendance at one meeting isn't the determining factor." Jonathan's exasperation crackled through the phone. "That's not the point, and you know it. This isn't about one meeting, it's about the message you're sending. Leaders in your position can't afford to appear weak or emotional. You stopped everything, Marcus. You personally dug a grave in the snow like some common laborer. Do you understand how that looks?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Marcus understood exactly how it looked, had anticipated every reaction, every criticism, every concerned phone call from people who valued appearances over authenticity. "It looks human, Jonathan. It looks like someone who remembered that business exists to serve people, not the other way around. That little boy deserved a proper burial, and his mother deserved help. Everything else could wait." Jonathan's sigh carried decades of corporate experience and traditional thinking. "Your grandfather built this company on strength and discipline. Your father maintained it through calculated risk and strategic vision. You've elevated it to unprecedented heights through sheer force of will and refusal to show weakness. This incident undermines everything that's made you successful. The board is concerned, Marcus. Very concerned." Marcus felt anger rising beneath his exhaustion, the kind that came from being questioned by people who had never faced real loss, who measured worth in quarterly profits and stock prices rather than human connections. "Let me be clear, Jonathan. I'm not taking a leave of absence, I'm not apologizing for helping Helena, and I'm not changing course based on the board's concerns. If they want to remove me as CEO, they're welcome to try. But they should remember that I hold controlling interest in this company, and replacing me would trigger clauses in dozens of contracts that would cost us significantly more than one delayed merger." The silence on Jonathan's end suggested he was recalculating his approach. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted from confrontational to carefully diplomatic. "No one is talking about removing you. We're concerned about your well-being, about making sure you're thinking clearly." Grief can cloud judgment, Marcus. We all saw what losing Daniel did to you. Marcus closed his eyes, fighting against the rage that threatened to overwhelm professional courtesy. Daniel's death taught me what actually matters, Jonathan. The board doesn't need to worry about my judgment. They need to worry about whether they want to be part of a company that values human compassion or one that prioritizes optics over ethics. He ended the call before Jonathan could respond, knowing he had probably just complicated his corporate relationship significantly, but unable to regret the truth he had spoken. Rebecca had been waiting outside his office, clearly having heard at least his side of the conversation through the open door. She entered now with fresh coffee and an expression that suggested she had something important to say. Sir, I took the liberty of arranging a press conference for tomorrow. If this story is going viral anyway, we should control the narrative. Marcus considered refusing, maintaining his usual policy of letting his actions speak louder than press releases. But Helena's future was now tied to his, and he owed her the best possible foundation for whatever came next. Fine. Draft talking points focusing on the Foundation's mission and our commitment to supporting families in crisis. Make it clear that what happened last night wasn't an isolated incident, but rather an example of values we intend to embody moving forward. Rebecca nodded, making notes on her tablet. What about Helena? The media will want her story. Marcus shook his head firmly. She's not available for interviews. Her privacy is protected. And anyone who tries to intrude on her grief will deal with our legal team. Make that absolutely clear. After Rebecca left to organize the press conference, Marcus returned to staring out his window, processing the rapid transformation of his carefully structured life. 3 days ago, he had been the Alpha King, untouchable and focused, moving through his existence with mechanical precision. Now he was Marcus again, vulnerable and uncertain, making decisions that confused everyone, including himself. But when he thought about Helena kneeling in that snow, about the small bundle wrapped in a blue blanket, about the exhausted relief in her eyes when the grave was finally complete, he knew he had made the right choice. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. This time it was Helena herself, looking uncomfortable in the new clothes, but more rested than she had been that morning. "I'm sorry to bother you," she began. But Marcus waved away the apology and gestured for her to sit. "I've been watching the news," she continued quietly. "I didn't realize helping me would cause you so much trouble." Marcus leaned forward, meeting her worried gaze with calm certainty. "You didn't cause anything, Helena. I made a choice, and I would make it again. The fallout is mine to handle." Helena twisted her hands in her lap, clearly struggling with something. "I don't want to be the reason you lose your company. If it would help, I could make a statement. Explain that you were just being kind, that it wasn't about weakness or poor judgment." The offer touched Marcus deeply. This woman who had lost everything still thinking about protecting him from consequences of his own actions. "No," he said gently. "This isn't about explaining or justifying. It's about standing firm on what's right. Besides, I'm not going to lose my company. Worst case scenario, I get some uncomfortable conversations with people who value money over compassion. Best case scenario, maybe this reminds other leaders that success without humanity is just expensive emptiness." They sat quietly for a moment, two people from completely different worlds finding unexpected common ground. "I never got to properly thank you," Helena finally said, "for stopping, for helping, for everything you're doing now. Ethan would have liked knowing that someone cared." Marcus felt emotion tightening his throat. "Daniel would have liked knowing I stopped. He always told me I drove past too many people who needed help." He stood and moved to the window, Helena joining him to look out over the city. "Tomorrow I'm holding a press conference about last night. The media attention will probably get intense for a while. Are you prepared for that?" Helena nodded slowly, her reflection in the glass showing both fear and determination. I survived losing my husband, my home, and my son. I can survive some reporters asking questions. Marcus admired her resilience, this woman who had been knocked down repeatedly by life and kept getting back up. Good. Because after the initial storm passes, we have work to do. Real work. Helping families like yours before they reach the desperate point where mothers are digging graves alone. If we're going to honor Ethan and Daniel properly, we need to make sure their deaths meant something. As evening fell over Great Falls, the first television reports about the cemetery incident aired on national news. Cameras showed the gravesite, interviewed townspeople from White Pine, and featured analysts debating whether Marcus Thorne's actions represented admirable compassion or concerning instability. Social media exploded with opinions, hot takes, and the kind of performative outrage that characterized modern discourse. Through it all, Marcus remained in his temporary office, drafting the foundation proposals that would transform Helena's tragedy into a catalyst for change. While Helena sat in her suite, processing the surreal reality that her most private grief had become national conversation. Neither of them slept well that night, kept awake by thoughts of what tomorrow's press conference might bring, by fears about futures that suddenly seemed more uncertain and more hopeful than either had imagined possible just days before. The conference room in the Great Falls Hilton had been transformed into a media circus. Cameras lined up in precise rows, reporters jostling for prime positions, and producers shouting last-minute instructions into their headsets. Marcus stood backstage with Rebecca, adjusting his tie for the third time and wishing he felt the confidence everyone expected from the Alpha King. Beside him, Helena looked terrified but resolute in the professional outfit Rebecca had helped her select, a simple navy dress that conveyed dignity without ostentation. They had agreed she would attend but not speak, her presence serving as a reminder that this press conference was about real people and real pain, not just corporate image management. Rebecca did a final check of the microphone system and nodded to Marcus. "You're on in 2 minutes. Remember to stay on message. Redirect any questions about the board or business implications, and whatever you do, don't let them bait you into saying anything that could be used against you in shareholder litigation." Marcus appreciated her concern, but knew that authentic communication couldn't be reduced to carefully scripted talking points. He was about to walk into that room and tell the truth, consequences be damned. The press conference began exactly on schedule, with Rebecca providing a brief introduction before stepping aside for Marcus. He approached the podium with Helena following slightly behind, her presence immediately shifting the energy in the room from aggressive interrogation to something more respectful. Marcus looked out at the sea of faces, cameras, and recording devices, took a breath, and began. 3 nights ago, while traveling through Montana, I encountered a woman burying her 7-year-old son alone in a cemetery. I stopped, and with the help of my team, we assisted her in completing that terrible but necessary task. Since then, there has been significant attention on this incident, and I want to address it directly. He paused, making eye contact with several reporters in the front row. I've been asked why I canceled important business meetings, why I personally participated in physical labor, why the Alpha King would behave in such an unprecedented manner. The answer is simple. Because it was the right thing to do. Because no parent should have to face that moment alone. Because business, no matter how important, will never be more important than basic human compassion. The room remained quiet, reporters scribbling notes or typing on laptops, the aggressive energy from earlier replaced by something more thoughtful. Marcus continued, his voice gaining strength as he spoke from the heart rather than from prepared remarks. 3 years ago, I lost my son Daniel to cancer. Despite having access to the best medical care money could buy, despite specialists and cutting-edge treatments, I watched my child die. That loss broke me in ways I'm still trying to understand. In the aftermath, I buried myself in work, convinced that the pain would fade if I just stayed busy enough, successful enough, powerful enough. It didn't work. Several reporters exchanged glances, clearly not expecting such personal vulnerability from someone known for his calculating business approach. When I saw Helena kneeling in that snow, I saw myself as I should have been during Daniel's illness, present and engaged, rather than hiding behind work obligations. She didn't know who I was, didn't ask for help, was simply doing what needed to be done with the resources she had available. In that moment, every meeting, every merger, every important business decision seemed exactly as significant as it actually is, which is to say not very significant compared to the weight of a parent's grief. Marcus gestured toward Helena, who stood with quiet dignity, despite clearly wanting to disappear. This woman lost everything, not because she was lazy or irresponsible or made poor choices, but because our systems failed her. She worked 2 jobs trying to support her son. She asked for help from community resources that had been defunded or overwhelmed. She took her sick child to an emergency room that turned them away due to lack of insurance. The reporters were fully engaged now, some looking uncomfortable as Marcus painted a picture of societal failure that implicated everyone, including themselves. So when people ask why I stopped, why I helped, why I'm willing to face criticism from board members and investors who think compassion is weakness, the answer is because we have to start somewhere. Because if people in positions of privilege and power don't use those advantages to help others, then what's the point of success? Daniel once asked me why I worked so much, and I told him it was to build a better future. He asked me, better for who? I didn't have a good answer then, but I have one now. Better for people like Helena and Ethan. For families struggling at the margins while the rest of us pursue wealth we don't need. Marcus announced the expansion of the Thorn Foundation to specifically address gaps in family support services, with Helena joining as Director of Community Outreach, a newly created position that would leverage her first-hand understanding of systemic failures. He outlined plans for emergency family assistance funds, partnerships with hospitals to prevent financial rejection of patients, and advocacy for policy changes that would prevent other parents from facing Helena's impossible choices. The media response was immediate and chaotic, with dozens of hands shooting up and voices calling out questions. If you've been moved by Helena and Marcus's story so far, I'd love to hear from you. Please leave a comment sharing which part has resonated with you most. Your engagement means everything to this channel, and I read every single comment. Let's keep this conversation going. Marcus pointed to a reporter from the Wall Street Journal who asked the question everyone wanted answered. Mr. Thorn, there are reports that the board of directors is concerned about your judgment. Some analysts are suggesting this incident indicates emotional instability that could affect your ability to lead Thorn Industries. How do you respond? Marcus leaned into the microphone, his voice calm but firm. I would suggest that a system which views helping a grieving mother as evidence of instability is itself deeply flawed. If the board wants to remove me as CEO because I prioritized human decency over a merger meeting, they're welcome to try. But I built this company into what it is today, and I'm not going to apologize for remembering why success matters in the first place. Another reporter, this time from CNN, directed her question to Helena. Ms. Marsh, how do you feel about becoming the center of this controversy? Helena glanced at Marcus, who nodded encouragement, then stepped forward slightly. Her voice was quiet, but steady as she spoke. I feel grateful that someone stopped when they didn't have to. I feel heartbroken that my son is dead. I feel angry that our society allows families to fall through the cracks. And I feel determined to make sure what happened to Ethan helps prevent it from happening to other children. Her raw honesty cut through the media noise, reminding everyone in that room that behind the corporate drama was a mother who had lost her child. The press conference continued for another 45 minutes, with Marcus fielding questions about foundation funding, business implications, and his personal motivations. He remained consistent in his message. Compassion wasn't weakness. Business existed to serve humanity, not the other way around. And he would continue leading Thorn Industries according to his values regardless of criticism. When a reporter from Fox Business suggested his actions might hurt shareholder value, Marcus responded with barely controlled frustration. If shareholders are more concerned about quarterly profits than about the kind of world we're building, They should sell their stock. I'm interested in sustainable long-term success that includes making society better, not just making money faster. As the press conference concluded, Marcus and Helena left through the back entrance to avoid the cameras that had gathered outside the main doors. Rebecca had arranged for them to return to the hotel via a service corridor, giving them space to decompress from the intense public scrutiny. In the quiet of the SUV, Helena finally allowed herself to shake, the adrenaline of the past hour catching up to her. "That was terrifying," she admitted, and Marcus nodded in agreement. "It gets easier, though it never becomes comfortable. You did well, Helena. You spoke truth, and people responded to that." They rode in silence for several minutes before Helena asked the question that had been bothering her since the press conference began. "What if they do remove you from the company? What if I'm the reason you lose everything you've built?" Marcus turned to look at her, his expression serious but not concerned. "Then we'll build something new. Daniel used to say that sometimes you have to break things to fix them properly. Maybe Thorn Industries needs to be broken before it can become what it should be." He paused, then added with a small smile, "Besides, I have enough money saved to keep us both comfortable for several lifetimes. The worst-case scenario isn't actually that bad." Back at the hotel, news alerts were already flooding in about the press conference. Initial reactions were mixed, with business publications critical of Marcus's emotional approach, while human interest outlets praised his compassion. Social media had exploded with the hashtag #JockAlphaKingHelps, with thousands of people sharing their own stories of loss, hardship, and times when strangers had made a difference. Several other CEOs had issued statements supporting Marcus's actions, while others distanced themselves from what they called an inappropriate mixing of personal feelings with professional responsibilities. That evening, Marcus and Helena shared dinner in his suite, both too exhausted to venture out, but too wired from the day's events to sleep. They talked about Daniel and Ethan, about the strange twist of fate that had brought them together, about the foundation work that lay ahead. Marcus showed Helena preliminary proposals for emergency assistance programs, asking for her input on what would have actually helped during her crisis with Ethan. Her suggestions were practical and grounded in real experience, exactly the perspective his foundation had been lacking despite years of well-intentioned but ultimately ineffective charity work. As midnight approached, Helena stood to return to her own suite, but paused at the door. "Marcus, why are you really doing all this? The foundation expansion, the job offer, all of it. You could have just helped me bury Ethan and moved on. Why are you risking your entire career for someone you just met?" Marcus considered the question carefully, wanting to give her the truth she deserved. "Because for 3 years, I've been looking for a way to honor Daniel's memory that actually meant something. Because helping you that night was the first time since he died that I felt human again. Because maybe if we can build something meaningful from our losses, then they weren't completely without purpose." Helena nodded slowly, understanding passing between them that required no further words. She left quietly, and Marcus returned to the window where he seemed to spend all his contemplative moments lately. Below, the city lights twinkled in the darkness, thousands of lives proceeding through their normal rhythms, unaware of the small revolution taking place in one hotel suite. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more criticism, and probably additional complications. But tonight, Marcus Thorne slept better than he had in 3 years, knowing he had finally started honoring his son's memory in a way that would have made Daniel proud. 6 weeks after the cemetery incident, Helena stood in her new office at Thorne Foundation headquarters in Seattle, still adjusting to the surreal reality of her transformed life. The space was modest by billionaire standards, but luxurious compared to the trailer park where she had lived with Ethan. Large windows overlooked Elliott Bay, and the walls displayed photographs of families the foundation had helped, each image a reminder of why this work mattered. Her title, Director of Community Outreach, came with responsibilities that terrified and energized her in equal measure. requiring her to transform personal tragedy into systematic change that could prevent others from experiencing similar pain. The transition hadn't been easy. Moving from Montana to Washington had meant leaving behind the grave where Ethan rested, a separation that still caused physical pain when Helena allowed herself to think about it. She had spent 2 days arranging for a proper headstone, a beautiful granite marker engraved with stars to match the blanket he loved, and a quote she had chosen carefully. "His light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." Marcus had attended the small dedication ceremony, the only other person present besides Helena and a local pastor, standing respectfully silent while she said goodbye to her son one more time. Professionally, Helena had discovered unexpected aptitude for the work Marcus had hired her to do. Her first-hand experience with systemic failures gave her insight that no amount of research could replicate, and her direct communication style resonated with families navigating crisis. She had personally overseen the development of emergency assistance protocols that cut through bureaucratic red tape, ensuring families could access funds within hours rather than weeks when medical emergencies arose. The foundation had helped 37 families in the first month alone, preventing evictions, covering medical bills, and providing the kind of immediate support that Helena had desperately needed and never received. Marcus had faced consequences for his actions, though they proved less severe than many had predicted. 3 board members had resigned in protest, replaced by people who shared his vision for compassionate capitalism. Several major investors had sold their stock, driving down share price temporarily before it recovered, as other investors recognized the long-term value of positive publicity and ethical business practices. The Hexen merger had collapsed, but 2 better opportunities had emerged in its wake, suggesting that perhaps authentic leadership was actually good for business. The Alpha King nickname had largely disappeared from media coverage, replaced by articles examining Marcus Thorne as a more complex and human figure. What surprised everyone, including Helena and Marcus themselves, was the deepening friendship that had developed between them over those 6 weeks. They had lunch together most days, initially to discuss foundation business, but increasingly just to talk, to share stories about their children, to process the grief they both carried. Marcus had shown Helena his favorite spots in Seattle, the quiet bookshops and coffee houses where he could escape the corporate world for brief periods. Helena had introduced Marcus to her new therapist, the first mental health professional he had agreed to see since Daniel's death, and those sessions were slowly helping him untangle the complicated web of guilt, grief, and delayed processing. Their relationship existed in a strange space between professional colleagues, friends bonded by shared tragedy, and something else neither was quite ready to name or examine. Helena noticed how Marcus's expression softened when she entered a room, how he made time for her regardless of other pressures on his schedule. Marcus found himself thinking about Helena during meetings, wondering what she would say about various business decisions, wanting to share small moments of his day with someone who understood loss in ways his other associates couldn't. They were both broken people, carefully rebuilding their lives, drawn together by circumstances that had transformed them both. The Foundation's work began attracting national attention, as other organizations recognized the effectiveness of Helena's approach. She had been invited to speak at conferences about family support services, had consulted with several state governments on emergency assistance programs, and had become an unlikely advocate for systemic change. Her testimony before a congressional committee about healthcare gaps had been particularly powerful, using Ethan's story to illustrate larger failures while maintaining enough composure to make concrete policy recommendations. Videos of that testimony had gone viral, with millions viewing her emotional but articulate explanation of how simple interventions could save lives. One afternoon in late spring, Marcus knocked on Helena's office door with an unusual request. "I'd like you to come to Montana with me this weekend," he said without preamble. "I want to visit Daniel's grave, and I was hoping you'd come with me. Maybe we could visit Ethan too." Helena felt emotion welling up at the invitation, understanding the significance of Marcus asking her to share that intensely personal pilgrimage. She agreed immediately, and 2 days later they flew to Helena's small regional airport on Marcus's private jet, then drove together to the cemetery where it had all begun. Daniel's grave was in a large metropolitan cemetery outside Billings, maintained meticulously with flowers and a bench nearby where visitors could sit. The headstone was elegant marble, engraved with his name, dates, and the simple phrase, "Beloved Son." Marcus had clearly visited often, as evidenced by the small toys and trinkets placed around the marker, each one representing a memory or inside joke between father and son. Helena stood back respectfully while Marcus knelt by the grave, speaking quietly to his son for several minutes. When he finished, he looked up at Helena with tears streaming down his face. "I told him about you and Ethan. I think he would have liked knowing I finally stopped running away from grief." They drove to White Pine next, the small town where Helena had lived her previous life. The cemetery looked different in spring, with grass beginning to emerge from melting snow and trees showing the first signs of new leaves. Ethan's headstone was exactly as Helena had specified, beautiful and dignified, marking the resting place of a boy whose life had been too short, but whose impact would ripple forward through his mother's work. Marcus stood beside Helena as she placed fresh flowers and talked to Ethan about everything that had happened, about the families they were helping, about how his death had led to changes that might save other children. As they prepared to leave, Helena noticed a woman approaching with a young boy, maybe 9 or 10 years old. The woman looked familiar, and Helena realized with a shock that it was Sarah Chen, a former neighbor from the trailer park who had been one of the few people who occasionally helped with childcare. "Helena," Sarah said warmly, embracing her. "I've been following your work with the foundation. You're doing amazing things." She gestured to her son. "This is Dylan. We were able to keep our home last month because of your emergency assistance program when I lost my job. I wanted to thank you personally." Helena felt tears streaming down her face as she hugged Sarah and Dylan, understanding in that moment that Ethan's death had created a ripple effect that was literally saving lives. Marcus stood slightly apart, watching the interaction with a small smile, seeing the confirmation of what he had believed from the beginning, that Helena's tragedy, if channeled properly, could transform into powerful change. As they walked back to the car, Helena took Marcus's hand spontaneously, a gesture of comfort and connection that surprised them both. He squeezed back gently, and they drove away from the cemetery in comfortable silence. That evening, sitting on the patio of a small bed and breakfast overlooking the Montana plains, Helena and Marcus talked about the future with a vulnerability neither had shown before. "I'm scared," Helena admitted. "Scared that I'm not qualified for this work, scared that I'll fail the families counting on us, scared that one day I'll wake up and this will all disappear like a dream." Marcus understood those fears intimately, having carried similar anxieties about his own worth and purpose since losing Daniel. "You're the most qualified person for this work precisely because of what you've been through," he said gently. "And you're not going to fail because you care too much to let that happen." Helena turned to look at him, really look at him, seeing beyond the wealth and power to the broken father who had stopped his convoy to help a stranger. "What about you?" she asked. "What are you scared of?" Marcus took a long breath before answering, his usual confidence replaced by raw honesty. "I'm scared that I waited too long to become the person Daniel needed me to be. I'm scared that helping you was just one moment of clarity in a life that will eventually return to empty ambition. But most of all, I'm scared of what I'm feeling right now." Helena's breath caught as she processed his words, understanding the unspoken implication beneath them. The past 6 weeks had changed them both, their shared grief creating a foundation for something neither had expected or sought. "What are you feeling?" she asked quietly, needing to hear him say it even though she already knew. Marcus turned to face her fully, his expression vulnerable in ways the Alpha King had never allowed. "I'm feeling like maybe loss doesn't have to be the end of the story. Like maybe two broken people can help each other heal. Like maybe I'm falling in love with you, and that terrifies me because I don't know if I deserve another chance at happiness. The confession hung between them in the evening air, weighted with significance and uncertainty. Helena felt her own heart responding, recognizing that what had started as gratitude and shared grief had evolved into something deeper, more complex. "I'm terrified too," she admitted. "Ethan has only been gone 2 months. I feel guilty even thinking about being happy again. But when I'm with you, the grief feels less overwhelming. You understand it in ways nobody else could." They sat in silence for several minutes, processing the shift in their relationship, acknowledging that something fundamental had changed between them. Marcus reached for Helena's hand again, this time with clear intention rather than spontaneous comfort. "We don't have to rush anything. We can take this as slowly as we need to. But I want you to know that you've given me something I thought was lost forever. Hope, purpose, a reason to be more than just successful." Helena leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling tears sliding down her cheeks, a mixture of grief for what she had lost and tentative joy for what might be possible. "Daniel and Ethan would want us to keep living," she whispered. "They would want us to find happiness again." The following months brought continued challenges and unexpected joys as Helena and Marcus navigated their evolving relationship alongside their professional partnership. The foundation expanded to 6 new cities, with Helena training other community outreach directors who brought their own experiences of hardship to the work. The program's success attracted additional funding from other corporations and philanthropists who recognized the effectiveness of combining resources with lived experience. Helena became a national voice for family support reform, testifying before additional legislative bodies and consulting with nonprofit organizations seeking to replicate their model. Marcus faced his own transformation, slowly learning to balance business leadership with authentic humanity. He implemented new policies at Thorn Industries that prioritized employee well-being alongside profits, establishing generous family leave benefits, mental health support programs, and emergency assistance funds for staff facing crisis. Some investors remained skeptical, but employee retention improved dramatically and productivity increased, suggesting that compassionate leadership was indeed compatible with business success. The Alpha King nickname disappeared entirely from media coverage, replaced by articles examining his work as a model for ethical capitalism. Helena and Marcus's romantic relationship developed gradually, built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared purpose. They attended therapy both individually and eventually as a couple, working through the complicated emotions of loving again after loss. Their first official date was simple: dinner at a quiet restaurant followed by a walk through Pike Place Market. Both of them nervous and uncertain but willing to take the risk. Their relationship remained private for several months, both protective of something precious and aware that public scrutiny would inevitably follow if their partnership became known. When they did eventually go public with their relationship, the media response was predictably intense but largely positive. Their story resonated with people who understood that love could emerge from unexpected places, that shared grief could create connections deeper than typical romance, that healing didn't require forgetting, but rather honoring what was lost while remaining open to new possibilities. Some critics accused Marcus of taking advantage of Helena's vulnerability, or Helena of being opportunistic. But those close to them recognized the authentic connection that had developed organically from shared experience and mutual support. 1 year after the cemetery incident, Helena and Marcus stood together at a ceremony dedicating the new Ethan Marsh Memorial Family Support Center in White Pine, Montana. The facility would provide emergency assistance, counseling services, and community resources to families throughout the region, ensuring that no parent would face the impossible choices Helena had confronted. Sarah Chen attended with Dylan, now thriving in school thanks to the stability the Foundation's assistance had provided their family. 3 other families helped by the program spoke during the ceremony, sharing stories of how timely intervention had prevented crisis from becoming catastrophe. Marcus gave a brief speech about how one small act of compassion had transformed his entire understanding of success and purpose. He talked about Daniel and Ethan, about 2 boys whose lives had been too short, but whose impacts would ripple forward through generations. He acknowledged that wealth and power were meaningless without human connection, that true leadership required vulnerability and authentic care for others. As he spoke, he reached for Helena's hand, a gesture that communicated everything words couldn't capture about their journey together. Helena spoke last, her voice stronger and more confident than it had been a year ago, but still carrying the weight of her loss. She talked about the morning she had knelt in the snow, convinced that nobody cared, that the world had completely forgotten her and Ethan. She described watching expensive vehicles approach, assuming they would pass by like everyone else, never imagining that the man driving would become her partner in creating change. She thanked Marcus not just for helping that night, but for seeing past her circumstances to recognize her value and potential. She ended by addressing the families in attendance directly, promising them that they would never have to face crisis alone again, that the center bearing her son's name would be there when systems failed and resources ran out. After the ceremony, Helena and Marcus visited both graves, placing flowers and speaking quietly to the boys who had brought them together. The Montana spring had fully arrived, transforming the cemetery from the frozen wasteland Helena remembered into something alive and growing. New grass covered Ethan's grave, and wildflowers had begun appearing around the edges. Marcus placed a small toy car next to Daniel's headstone, explaining to his son about the family support center and how his death had ultimately led to changes that were saving lives. As they prepared to leave, Helena paused at Ethan's grave one final time. "I'm going to be okay, baby," she whispered. "We're going to be okay. And because of you, other families are going to be okay too. Your life mattered, Ethan. It mattered so much." Marcus stood beside her, his arm around her shoulders, both of them understanding that grief didn't disappear, but rather transformed, becoming part of who they were without defining everything they would become. They drove away from the cemetery as evening fell, heading toward a future neither could have imagined during that terrible night in the snow. The foundation would continue growing, helping more families and preventing more tragedies. Helena would keep advocating for systemic change, using her voice to ensure that vulnerable families received the support they deserved. Marcus would continue transforming his business empire into something that honored his son's memory by actually making the world better. And together, they would build a life that honored their lost children, while remaining open to the love and joy that healing eventually made possible. 2 years later, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, Helena and Marcus stood in a small chapel surrounded by close friends and family, exchanging vows that acknowledged their complicated journey to this moment. The ceremony was simple and intimate, with photographs of Daniel and Ethan displayed prominently, ensuring that the boys who had brought them together remained part of their celebration. When the officiant pronounced them married, they kissed softly, both crying openly, their tears representing grief and joy intermingled in ways that no longer seemed contradictory. That evening, at the small reception, Sarah Chen approached with important news. Dylan had been accepted to a prestigious scholarship program for students from low-income backgrounds, his path forward secured by the stability Helena's foundation had provided. Another mother shared that her daughter had received life-saving treatment after emergency assistance covered the medical bills traditional insurance had denied. Story after story illustrated how that single act of compassion in a frozen cemetery had cascaded into countless lives changed, families saved, and futures secured. As the celebration wound down, Helena and Marcus slipped away to a quiet corner, watching their guests dance and laugh and celebrate. "Do you think they're proud of us?" Helena asked, referring to Daniel and Ethan. Marcus pulled her close, resting his chin on her head. "I think they're the reason we found each other. I think they guided us to that cemetery at exactly the right moment. I think they're absolutely proud of what we've built from our grief." The foundation continued expanding over the following years, eventually operating in 23 cities across America, with plans for international expansion. Helena became a leading voice in family advocacy, her testimony helping pass landmark legislation, protecting vulnerable families from medical bankruptcies and housing instability. Marcus transformed Thorne Industries into a model for corporate social responsibility, proving that profitable business could coexist with genuine compassion. Together, they established scholarship programs in Daniel and Ethan's names, ensuring that economic circumstances wouldn't limit children's potential. On quiet evenings, they would sometimes return to Montana, visiting the graves and sitting peacefully in the places where their journey had begun. The cemetery became a sanctuary, rather than a source of pain, a physical space where they could connect with their lost children while celebrating the lives they had built, honoring those memories. Helena would tell Ethan about the families helped that month, sharing stories that demonstrated how his death had created ripples of change that continued spreading. Marcus would tell Daniel about business decisions guided by compassion, about choosing human needs over profit margins, about becoming the father his son had always believed he could be. Their story became something of a legend, shared at foundation events and business conferences as an example of how tragedy could transform into purpose when met with courage and authenticity. People spoke of the Alpha King who had remembered his humanity and the grieving mother who had channeled her pain into powerful advocacy. But Helena and Marcus thought of themselves simply as two broken people who had helped each other heal, who had learned that love could bloom even in frozen ground. That loss didn't have to be the end of the story, but rather the beginning of something meaningful and beautiful. Years later, when Helena stood to accept a National Humanitarian Award for her work, transforming family support services, she spoke about that night in the snow, with the same raw emotion she had carried from the beginning. She talked about being at her absolute lowest point, convinced that nobody cared, feeling completely invisible and forgotten. She described the miracle of vehicles stopping when they could have passed, of a powerful man choosing compassion over convenience, of strangers working together to honor one small boy's memory, and she reminded the audience that every single person had the power to stop, to help, to see someone else's pain, and choose to do something about it. Marcus sat in the front row, tears streaming down his face, proud beyond words of the woman Helena had become, and grateful every day for the grief that had brought them together. He thought about Daniel constantly, about the lessons his son had tried to teach him before it was too late. He understood now that success without compassion was hollow, that power without humanity was meaningless, that the only legacy worth leaving was one built on genuine care for others. The night in the cemetery had cost him some business relationships and comfortable assumptions about leadership, but it had given him something infinitely more valuable. A second chance to live according to his values, to honor his son properly, to build a life of actual significance. As they left the ceremony together, hand in hand, Helena and Marcus passed a young mother struggling with a stroller and heavy bags. Without hesitation, they both stopped to help, Marcus carrying her bags while Helena entertained the fussy baby. The mother thanked them profusely, clearly not recognizing the famous humanitarian and billionaire CEO helping her with such ordinary tasks. Helena and Marcus exchanged knowing smiles, understanding that this simple moment contained everything their journey had taught them. That stopping to help strangers wasn't weakness but strength. That compassion was its own reward. That every small act of kindness rippled forward in ways impossible to predict or measure. The snow had long since melted from that Montana cemetery, spring and summer having come and gone many times over. But the lessons learned during that frozen night remained permanently etched into their hearts. That love persists beyond death. That grief can transform into purpose. That two broken people can help each other heal. And that sometimes the most powerful force in the world is simply one human being choosing to stop and help another, even when continuing on would be easier. Their children were gone, but never forgotten. Their memories living on through every family helped, every life saved, every moment of compassion extended to strangers who needed it most. And on quiet nights when sleep proved elusive, both Helena and Marcus would remember that cemetery, that snow, that impossible task made bearable through unexpected kindness. They would remember the moment everything changed, when the Alpha King stopped being just a business leader, and Helena stopped being just a grieving mother, when both became something more through the transformative power of shared suffering and authentic human connection. They had learned that winter could give way to spring, that frozen ground could eventually nurture new growth, and that love, in all its forms, was always worth the risk of reaching out into the darkness, hoping to find another hand reaching back. The story that began with unspeakable loss had transformed into something beautiful and redemptive, proving that even our deepest pain could become the foundation for meaningful change if we had the courage to face it honestly and the wisdom to transform suffering into service. Helena and Marcus had found each other in the worst possible moment and built something extraordinary from their shared brokenness, honoring their lost sons by ensuring that their deaths created ripples of compassion that would continue spreading long after the snow melted and new seasons arrived. In memory of all the children lost too soon, and the parents who carry them forward through lives of courage, compassion, and determined hope.